Welcome to Quadriga. Our topic today, the latest turn in an election that never ceases to surprise. A week after release of an 11-year-old tape in which Donald Trump bragged about sexual assaults on women, the Republican Party is in disarray, with leading Republicans announcing they will no longer support the candidate. Trump's poll numbers are in free fall just a few weeks after he appeared to be closing in on Democrat Hillary Clinton. But Trump insists he's not quitting. Sex, lies, and videotape. Is Trump finished? That's our title question today, and we want to get some answers from three people who are following the U.S. election closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Alison Smale. She's the Berlin bureau chief of the New York Times, and she says, I never really believed Donald Trump would win, but in this election, a lot of things have turned out differently than expected. That's why I'm very careful when it comes to predictions. Ulrike Herrmann is a business editor at the Berlin daily The Taz. She believes Trump's problem isn't his sexism, it's that he talked about sex. I can't imagine Trump will be elected president. And finally, great to have Alan Posner back on the show. He's an Anglo-German author and regular commentator for the Berlin-based newspaper Die Welt. And he says Trump was right. He just said what Bill Clinton did. As this sinks in, Trump might even gain from the episode. Alison Smale, as I mentioned, polls are indeed taking a dramatic turn downward for Mr. Trump. But the fact is that there's always a very dynamic phase in this final stage of the race as undecided voters finally begin to make up their minds. How much of a role is this whole sex tape really playing?
Well, I think, as I believe Andy Rosenthal wrote in the New York Times yesterday or the day before, this showed us that Donald Trump, who we basically knew was there, basically perhaps sort of very clearly showing us Donald Trump in that mode. Now other women have come forward to the New York Times, and I'm sure they will to other media too, saying, oh, this wasn't just then, I can name this incident, that incident where he behaved inappropriately. As with the entire Trump phenomenon, to suddenly sort of say, oh my gosh, we didn't know that this was him, I think everybody sort of did know. So whether this affects the race or not, I'm not so sure. Excuse me. There's been constant surprises in this year, not just in the United States. I mean, let's think about Brexit, for instance. And what I think we can see is a world in which the certainties we thought we had are kind of shifting before our eyes, and everybody is adjusting to that shifting reality. So we live to be surprised. There could be another big surprise before polling day. But right now, it would appear that Donald Trump has scant chance of winning. I still wouldn't rule it out completely. My favorite example is to think of a group of people who arrange on Facebook or some other means of communication, okay, we're for Trump, let's make sure we take 10 people each to the polling station on polling day. So long as it's not a state where you have to be registered beforehand to vote at all, you can do that. It flies under the radar of any kind of opinion polling because it's not traditional organization. We know that Hillary Clinton is very well organized by conventional measures, but precisely what hasn't really worked this year is convention.
Let's come back in a bit to the mechanics of the race and issues such as polling. But let me pick up on your remark that the Times has just found two women who do, in fact, confirm that it wasn't only locker room talk on that tape. Alan Posner, you said that you would agree with Donald Trump that he simply said what Bill Clinton did. But apparently, according to these claims now published by the Times, this wasn't just talk. One woman has a very clear account of him physically groping her on a plane. So clearly, there were deeds behind these words.
Yeah, well, it's difficult as the only man in the room, sort of to say what I'm saying. But the first thing is that any man who's honest will tell you that it's true what Donald Trump says. Men, not every group of men, not all the time, but men talk like that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, OK, so Trump gropes women because he thinks they want that. right? And he's an oaf and a fool. But Bill Clinton used state troopers to procure his women. He slept with an internee at the White House. And Hillary's reaction was to say he had a bimbo problem. Bimbo meaning, that's her word for, you know, the women Bill slept with. Now, this is all so horrible. I'm just saying it's not a Republican problem. It's not even a specific Trump problem. It's a male problem, and it's a problem of females, women, who cover for this kind of man. And I think it's, you know, this is... Trump has said he's unshackled now because the Republican Party is disowning him. I wonder what he's going to dig up on Hillary and Bill, and it's not going to be nice.
As tempting as it might be to now open up discussion on Bill Clinton's peccadillos as well, I'm going to leave that aside because otherwise we won't stay with the topic at hand, which, of course, is whether Trump is finished. You implied you thought he could come back from these allegations, potentially, perhaps also from two women going to the Times and telling their stories. But the fact is, he needs women voters. They make up the majority of the undecided voters. Do you really think that they're going to take the same view that you just gave us?
I think there's... Well, firstly, his basis was always white males of a certain education and a certain...
But he's got to broaden that, doesn't he?
He's got to broaden that, and he hasn't... But, you know, you might find Hispanic males who hitherto didn't like him calling Mexicans racist, feeling that this sort of macho way of talking was kind of nice. You might even find black males saying the same thing. You might even find, you know, the kind of... I mean, listen to country music, you know, even when sung by women. It's all about that kind of man. So, and then it says, stand by your man, right? Because after all, he's just a man. I really don't know what might or might not happen. And, you know, I wish women would rise up as one and say, no, this is you know, he's had it. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, Cameron, what do you think?
Well, I think that the problem is slightly a different one. I think that everyone always knew that he was an oaf, as you said, and that he was sexist as well. I mean, that was common knowledge. That is nothing new. But I think the problem is that he talked about sex in a very blatant way. And, you know, the voters he has to catch, for example, all these conservative and religious voters, and they don't want to talk about sex. It's different here in Europe. Everyone talks about sex.
Actually, you know, he had talked about sex plenty before. Remember the debate during the primaries when he actually more or less bragged about the size and effectiveness of his sexual equipment?
Well, that's true, yeah. But
that doesn't seem to have cost him support. So isn't there a difference here? But the difference here is actually he's talking about assault.
No, about rape.
He's talking about molestation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I thought that, well, still, I think that he never ever, I agree with Alan that he never ever had much chance or stood much chance with the women. And I think that it just drove home again that he was sex-driven. And I think that's very, perhaps it's not a problem for conservative voters, but I can't imagine all these Tea Party guys voting for him. I mean, because that's not their ideal of how you should behave as a church-going president. But perhaps it's not a problem. I can't really tell, but I guess it was so very blatant that you can just not...
you know, I think, may I say, in a way, it's great that it's happening. Because remember when Bill Clinton did this stuff, I mean, it was all... The whole Republican Party was up in arms saying, how can you? And, you know, and this is a question of character... rules out Clinton as president.
It wasn't just the Republican Party, it was everybody.
It was everybody.
Saying,
and now,
my goodness, he's brought public discourse down to a kind of a new low. Well, here we go.
Well,
it's even lower.
But now the same Democrats who defended Bill Clinton saying, well, that's his private matter, his private parts are his private matter. Now they're all accusing, you know, Trump. And the great thing is that, you know, the question of who is for what and the whole moral issue, the cultural wars have been declared invalid. You know, the Republican Party is supporting a sexist oath, and
But Actually, the fact is the Republican Party is by no means united anymore in supporting Mr. Trump. Alison Smil, your paper published a long list of, Trump would say, of course, the Times is a party of its own,
yes,
but
right.
we'll leave that aside. Your paper published a long list of Republicans who are now deserting what they clearly perceive to be a sinking ship. Among them, just most recently, John McCain, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Condoleezza Rice, all saying they can't vote for Mr. Trump. You know, isn't there a certain element of hypocrisy here? It has been perfectly clear for a long time.
Show me the politics that exists without hypocrisy. But I would like to go back a little bit to your point that what happens afterwards is really kind of the important thing here, I think. And whether it's the culture wars or whatever, these are all substitutes for what is essentially a struggle for power, which traditionally in the United States has been framed as a struggle between Democrats and Republicans, broadly speaking, people of the sort of centre-right and broadly speaking, centre more left. But I'm not so sure that left and right are particularly helpful because those European terms don't really apply when you get to US politics. So I think it's much more interesting to see what will remain of this fight the day after there is a decision, and what will the reality after the election do to resolve the basic issues that it has thrown up and which are not going to be solved by the choice of either Clinton or Trump per se.
Can we just come back to that a little bit later? Sure. I do absolutely want to focus on that point toward the end, but I'd like to take a brief look first at the storm that has been unleashed by release of the tape, and in particular at the Twitter storm that Mr. Trump himself has now unchained.
Trump launched a blistering attack on House Speaker Paul Ryan, the country's highest-ranking Republican. Despite winning the second debate in a landslide, it is hard to do well when Paul Ryan and others give zero support. Trump called Ryan a very weak and ineffective leader. And then this: "It's so nice that the shackles have been taken off me, and I can now fight for America the way I want to."
So, Alan Posner, as I said, your opening statement implies that you do think Trump can come back from this. But does he not need the Republican Party organization, where his own campaign organization is so weak on the ground, particularly in the swing states? Doesn't he need their backing? And he is now absolutely flouting them.
Well, yeah, well, the first thing you have to say is that, again, he's right in that he's cast off the shackles. I mean, McCain says now he can't vote for Trump, and he could vote for someone who called Mexicans a rapist, who said in a TV show that a woman had blood coming out of her. That was all right then. You know, I mean, come on. The whole, I think, you know, all these people who are now against Trump from the Republican Party, I'm saying, guys and gals, or some of them, you know, you're too late, right? So if he's casting them off, I think it will, in fact, galvanize his support, which was never over the traditional Republican apparatus. I think he really has a chance to say, you know, his whole pitch has been, I'm the new guy. I'm not part of the establishment. I say what I think. I do what I say. And, you know, I think it'll work. It'll work with the sort of aggressive, resentment-laden male voter who says, finally, there's a guy who's a real macho and doesn't kowtow to these Washington politicos.
I'm not even sure it's resentment-laden people only, honestly. I think that there is, you know, Americans are always questing for something new. And there's a willingness to sort of say, well, you know, maybe this guy is going to shake things up. I found it interesting that Ken Bone, the unexpected hit of the second debate, the man who wore his red sweater on television and posed a question about energy, in one of the many interviews he then did afterwards, after he became an internet sensation, for at least 5 minutes, and he sort of said, well, economically, he ought to be going with Trump because he works in the coal sector, and what Trump is sort of saying more echoes closely the nature of his day-to-day problems. But that it would be impossible for him personally to do that because things like marriage equality and other rights that have been won by minorities are too hard fought a victory to be given up. I just found that interesting, very interesting, because this was not somebody who was, you know, frothing at the mouth with anger on either score. He was just taking a fairly sanguine look. And he did not, out of hand, reject Trump's arguments, while at the same time praising things that are much more likely to put him in the Hillary camp.
But I think, well, you're right when you say that the conservative establishment could have somehow be angry with Trump before because of what he had said. But I think the interesting thing is that, and I think that's what it is all about, that the surveys clearly showed that Trump lost support, let's say, for the last 4 weeks. And then, you know, the conservative establishment was just looking for a good reason to somehow get away from Trump before it is too late. For them, it's gone, not gone. For them, it's clear that they will lose the race for presidency. And now the only question is how to keep the majority in the House and what to do afterwards. They do not want to be part of the sinking ship. So they all went overboard as soon as possible. And this video was just an excuse to get rid of Trump. But they would have found another excuse if this video hadn't been excavated by the Washington Post.
But particularly strange is the fact that some of the rats that have plunged from the ship are now apparently sort of halfway trying to crawl back on. At least 4 members of the House and Senate now apparently said they weren't really rejecting the top of the ticket. They were just kind of, you know, a little disturbed about the tape. Alan Posner, the Republican Party is in tremendous disarray. Do you really believe that polls are so inaccurate that at the end of the day, they can come back from this to win the election, both for the presidency and both chambers of the Congress?
Well, yes, I do. Just a short answer. But I think the problem is really the party is in disarray because it has nothing to do, everything the party stands for, the party of Abraham Lincoln, for God's sake, has nothing to do with what Trump stands for. The problem with Trump, I mean, yeah, I hate what he said about women. The real problem is what he's saying about Mr. Putin, for instance, that he thinks he's a nice guy, that he could get on with him, for instance, or that he somehow thinks, in the same breath, he says that, you know, he could deal with ISIS in a stroke of the pen and then wanting to build this war on immigration. These are the real problems. And he has no coherent policy, and the policies he has have nothing to do with the sort of small government, basically liberal in the economic sense, policies that, shall we say, Mitt Romney or Ronald Reagan stood for. And this is the really terrible thing. There's a, you know, if he actually got into the White House, what would he do with that party? You know, I mean, he would...
What would he do with that position of power? Who would he appoint to govern with him? I mean, it's all very unclear.
Well, he might form a new party which sort of
No,
support...
I mean, very possibly, but we've known that the Republican Party has been in some disarray for some years. The appearance of the Tea Party has basically forced an ideological struggle upon the Republicans, and that has been in full swing for at least the past 2 major national elections, if not longer.
The assessment of many people, of course, was that the approach that was taken by Donald Trump at this latest debate and the approach he's essentially using now that he's unshackled is to throw red meat at his core voters, many of whom are disgusted with the party elite in the Republican ranks. Let's take a look at one of those core Trump voters with whom my colleagues in the U.S. spoke.
Rancher Jim Chilton shows us around his property in southern Arizona. More than 200 square kilometers. Part of it runs along the border with Mexico. Chilton says the U.S. government is not doing enough to protect him and other local ranchers from Mexican smugglers. These pictures were taken last year by hidden cameras on Jim's property.
It's hilarious. to think that the United States boundary on my ranch is nothing but a 4-strand barbed wire fence.
Jim says the border authorities should replace that with a real fence, plus checkpoints and more frequent patrols. Right now, the nearest border station is about 3 hours north of here.
Why not have a wall and roads, and why not allow people to come in this country legally?
So, Alan Posner, you didn't really believe Trump's boasting when it came to his prowess with women. Do you believe his claims about building the wall? He says it's the first thing he's going to do when he gets into the White House. Do you think he'll follow through if he's elected?
Yeah, why not? I mean, I think he can do it. He might not get Mexico to pay for it, as he says he will, but he can do what that rancher said. He can put up a... I mean, there already is along the Rio Grande a whole lot of, you know, protective devices and so on. All he needs to do is to increase that. Of course he can do it. Fences are going up in Europe, all over, round nations all over the place. It's a horrible thing, and he's part of a trend.
We have just a few minutes left, and I really would like to come back to the question that Alison Smale posed a bit earlier on about what happens on the day after. Two of you believe that the day after will be in the hands of Hillary Clinton. Alan Posner believes it could wind up being in the hands of Donald Trump. Regardless who you think is going to win, a lot of ghosts have been let out of the bottle in the course of this election. We've had some of the most vulgar, poisonous discourse that we have ever seen in a U.S. election. What happens after this election? How does the U.S. come back from that? Ulrike Hammond?
Well, I think it's the most important question is whether the Republicans will have a majority in the House and in the Senate. If they lose just the presidency, for them, it's no problem, because then they would just continue what they did when Obama was president. They would just obstruct every kind of policy and then claim that there was no political aim at Washington that was somehow worth fighting for.
But in other words, that is exactly the recipe for a continuation and a worsening of what we have now, because it is the paralysis and the polarization in Washington that fed the anger that we're seeing in this election.
And that's something that Republicans apparently don't understand. I don't have the feeling that Paul Ryan understands why the Republicans are losing power. They still think, I guess, that it is a very good idea to just continue obstructing policy or politics. And what the basic issue then has to be addressed is that the majority of the Americans lose out. For the last 40 years, the salaries in real terms have not risen for the majority, but everything became more expensive.
Some rise in middle-class income in the past year, but...
Yeah, but you can just look at the statistics. For the last 40 years, nothing happened for the majority. And at the same time, everything became more expensive, and especially the universities. So, and that's why there was such a big students' unrest, and because that's why they all supported Bernie Sanders. And you really have to address these issues if you want if you want to be the United States to be a country that can be ruled.
Alison Smale, another aspect. We've seen some very strong denigrating of U.S. institutions on the part of Donald Trump. Your paper found the most disturbing aspect of the most recent debate, not the discussion about the sex tape, but Donald Trump's call for a special prosecutor who would throw Hillary Clinton in jail. That's not U.S. constitutional democracy. Does that do lasting damage to U.S. institutions?
Well, I think it certainly poses a test for those institutions, and that's precisely what we've seen across the board this year. And I do think we just need to ask ourselves the very basic question, what is democracy? And do we, as the German historian Fritz Stern said in one of his last interviews before he died, sadly, earlier this year, you know, democracy must be defended, is what he said. And I think that that's the basic question that we all have to ask ourselves. I mean, kind of forget all the Sturm und Drang about every peccadillo of Mr. Trump or every sort of question about Hillary Clinton's behavior as Secretary of State, the wisdom of using this private email server, and move beyond those specific issues, none of which are so trivial, to the very basic question, what are we going to do with our future? We all know that the world is changing rapidly. Some of the reason why we've seen people like Mr. Trump rise is because people are looking for what they perceived to be certainty in a very quickly shifting world. And so it is up to us, I think, to sort of orient ourselves towards our basic values. And there, the question is, will the Republican Party finally sort of have the debate, settle its own internal debate? And will it continue to have influence through the Senate and the House? Or is the Democratic, is there a prospect of a Democratic majority?
And Ellen, very briefly, if you would, please, what happens to Donald Trump himself? You say he's not finished. Does he just go back to business as usual?
No, he forms a fascist party, misogynic party to fight Hillary Clinton. If he's in the presidency, he also forms a fascist party to ensure the continuance of his rule. If he loses, America's even more divided than it is now. And that's what he's going to do.
Very dystopian last words. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.